Hi, I'm Rachel, and I'm here to do a tag of sorts. Last month, Joey at Game of Authors started a decade-oriented tag about our reading in the teens, and he wanted us to talk about our longest books that we read year by year. And I think, like a lot of people, that made me consult my Goodreads stats, particularly the page they give us at the end of each year, which gives us a lot of compiled items, often in fun, iconic form. And that got me to thinking that these fun, iconic things on the Goodreads stats were a lot more expansive than just the longest book, and that I could stretch this out into a few videos based on Goodreads stats of what I read in the last decade. So I thought I would start with the stats of what they give me for my longest and my shortest books per year, and I'll just insert icons up above. Hopefully I'll make this snappy because I'm not sure how much battery I have left here with these little bars, and I do have 20 books to talk about. I should also mention this might be interesting for me personally because my reading certainly changed throughout last decade. In the earlier years, I was reading fewer books and less widely than I was by the end, so we'll see. In 2010, the shortest book I've read was Mrs. Dalloway's Party by Virginia Woolf, and the longest book was Rebecca, an American Girl series, which I guess is a cheat because technically those aren't just one book. A lot of times I think you'll find in some of these stats I ended up putting series together as one item because I didn't want to write a review for all of them, and I write reviews for everything I do on Goodreads. That being said, I enjoyed the Rebecca series. I was excited when they introduced a Jewish character to the lineup, and I felt that her stories were much in line with the rest of the American Girls. You know, she was plucky and opinionated and adventurous. And of course there were some twins and a roguish uncle in her family, I believe, as well as reference to Jewish holidays and Jewish history, which I was happy with. As for Mrs. Dalloway's Party, I liked it, you know, because I also like the novel that has the main character in it, and it was a stream of consciousness that really worked for me, going from party attendee to party attendee and getting into their heads. That's what I remember from it. In 2011, the shortest book I read was Our Haggadah, Uniting Traditions by Cokie Roberts and her husband. And the longest book I read was A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin. I admit I don't really remember much about the Haggadah, although I do own it, and I even, at the time, wrote a blog post about it, which I can link down below. Coming from an interfaith family myself, I'm always curious about how other people deal with the unusual trajectory into those traditions. This is the book I most know Cokie Roberts for, which I know is perhaps a little sacrilege on its own. As for A Storm of Swords, well, I think most of us know what that is. It is the third book in the Game of Thrones book series, more commonly known as A Song of Ice and Fire. It is the book that contains the Red Wedding, which is, I think, seen as the big volcanic moment, although it actually is not at the end of the book. And also, I think some people think of it as Robb's wedding, but the king who died, but actually the bride and groom did survive the wedding. I think this is also seen as the book that's sort of the end of the popular books, because in the next two books, which came out much later, first of all, that's when he started splitting up character narratives, and also we expanded all the time and got all sorts of new characters that I think never got the popularity of the old ones. So in that way, I think A Storm of Swords is a stronger book than the two that came after it, although for me personally, I never identify much with these books on their own as much as the overall story, and particularly Sansa Stark's story. In 2012, these numbers are relatively close. I did not read very many books that were long or perhaps too short. The shortest book I read was called Blue Nude, and it was a Jewish contemporary book about, I believe, a Jewish art student and a German teacher who had a family that was involved with the Nazis back in the day. And I think one of the things I do remember about it is how it portrayed his family's, and particularly his sister's connection with Hitler Youth, and just how pervasive it was to try to get the German people into that, you know, sort of nationalistic fervor. That's the most of what mostly what I remember about it. And my longest book, Catching Fire by Suzanne Collins. I've decided this is the YA novel I might fight to the death about. I'll give up all others. You'll see some others on this list too, but Catching Fire and the Hunger Games series, I think, it's very special to me, and I think it is unfairly maligned, even by my mother tonight, who randomly threw off a comment to me that got me irked. So many YA novels and fairy tale fantasy novels are about chosen ones and people who, you know, get through the story by sheer luck. And people see Katniss that way, and it's so not true, and particularly in Catching Fire, where everything that she went through and the fact that she got out alive was orchestrated by people outside of her control and without her knowledge. And in fact, in a lot of ways, Katniss is a pawn in the story, and that is due to the fact that Suzanne Collins is very interested not only in badass heroines, but in the systems that she is a part of, these systems of propaganda, totalitarianism, and rebellion, and it's just so much bigger than people think it is, and I love this series, and it was, as well as appearing on this list, I'm sure it was my favorite read of the year. Moving on to 2013, in the Hunger Games vein, the shortest book I've read was The Girl Who Was on Fire, which was a bunch of essays about the series, and, you know, a bit up and down. I liked some of them more than I liked others. And the longest book I read was Allegiant by Veronica Roth. Yes, it has some topical similarities with the Hunger Games, but I do think Triss is very much more of the lucky hero, and gosh, like a lot of fans, Allegiant really really brought down the series for me. I wasn't thrilled with the entire series overall, but this one got kind of crazy with confusing magic and science, and the whole world building, such as it was, completely went off the rails, and it was all a bit ridiculous, and even the movies at this point couldn't sustain themselves apparently, and we'll never get the end of that story. In 2014, the shortest book I read was The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and I'm sure I read it because I wanted to orient myself with, you know, reading classical children's stories, but I honestly couldn't tell you much about it now. I'm embarrassed. I guess it maybe wasn't fully for me. And then the longest book I read, again, is a bit of a cheat. I just put in the entire Mortal Instruments series, books 1 through 5. Well, actually, that's, I think, not all of it, it's just 5 of them. But anyway, obviously, it's not one book, it's all of them. I didn't want to write a review for all of them. Overall, with this series, which is urban fantasy about demon hunters and vampires and werewolves and mundanes, I wasn't too impressed. I think elements of the world building were interesting. I know YA fantasy has a penchant for the melodramatic, but the family dynamics in this one, particularly all of the incestuous overtones, seem to be a bit much for me. But I admit that part of my problem with this series really has to do with the author herself, Cassandra Clare, and the provenance of her inspiration for these books, which came from Harry Potter fan fiction, which was widely reported to have plagiarized elements. I mean, not from Harry Potter, I get it, it's fan fiction, but from other stories. And being part of the Potter fandom as I was when I was younger, she did not have the best reputation. But she has a very different reputation now as an author, but I don't think her work is for me. In 2015, the shortest novel I read was called American Children. It was a novel I saw randomly at my library job, a Jewish-themed novel published in the 80s, so I was curious because obviously you won't see it around much anymore, but frankly, you don't need to see it around. It was not very good. And the longest novel I read was the Morgaine Saga by C.H. Cherryh. Again, this is actually a series, but this one was a bind-up at least, so that all the books were in one volume. That being said, I'm almost positive I more skimmed it than read it, and I had a lot of trouble with it. It just found it to be way too overwhelming and not compelling enough for me. Although now that I'm on BookTube and I listen to people in the BookTube SFF community, I see how a lot of people love this author, and makes me curious to see if I should give her another go. I read these books because of a family friend who insisted that, you know, because of my love of sci-fi and fantasy, I should try this author out. And he is backed by the community, so it seems. So, I don't know, maybe someday someone will do a buddy read with me of another one of her novels. In 2016, the shortest book I read was A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, which I read very, very quickly. In fact, I read it on New Year's Eve, just trying to make, you know, a book count goal, and I thought because it was short it would be easy, but of course, it's Virginia Woolf. It's not necessarily easy. It's very compelling, but I wish I had a little bit more time to read it. I guess maybe it's especially because it was a couple essays in one. I found it relatively disjointed, but certainly the ideas in it, particularly about the idea of Shakespeare's sister and what would have happened to a woman in that time who wanted to write, or the need for a woman to have room of one's own to write, of course they stick with me. And then the longest book I've read is the end of another YA series, Winter by Marissa Meyer. This book was ridiculously bloated, and much like Allegiant, I felt like whatever scant world building it had kind of completely fell apart with this overwrought ending. I wasn't a fan about how the final showdown went on with Queen Lavanna, the evil Queen of the Moon, and the sudden army that, you know, came up to defeat her, and her stepdaughter, who was really weirdly coded to me. She sounded like she was 7 and she was supposed to be much older. Definitely not a fan of that one so much. In 2017, the shortest book I've read is called Legends of the Californios, which I picked up in San Diego when I was there. It was published by a small press, and it was about a hyper-local community, sort of the Mexican Indian community in that area. And unfortunately, as much as I wanted to get, you know, a local perspective and support, you know, small publishing, it wasn't that good of a novel. The longest book I've read is another YA novel. What do I say? These YA fantasies are pretty long. It's Gemina. This is a novel about sort of kick-ass teenagers fighting the man in space, basically, fighting an authoritarian government. And these are definitely, you know, chosen one heroes who, you know, just kick ass and get through everything because they're lucky. You know, that is the type of story this is. But listening to it on audio with a full cast, because it's sort of told in found document style, was so much fun. So, you know, it's not, you know, a wonderful work of art or anything, but it was a lot of fun to listen to. Some repeating themes here for 2018, where the first shortest book I've read was The Second Mango, which is another small publisher. I believe she published this first with a very small press that went out of business, and then she self-published it. This is a Jewish YA fantasy, I guess, about sort of an epic fantasy queendom with Jewish lesbian leads and some sort of minor Jewish overtones to the characters, and it was fun, but it was sort of ridiculous and not very believable in any way. And then the longest book I read was Obsidio, which was the final book and the sequel to Gemina. And for this one, this was the end of the trilogy, and it tried to, you know, wrap things up and have a point and try to be serious, and that's not what this series is about, you know? It's about kick-ass teenagers being kick-ass because it's kick-ass, you know? So when they tried to, you know, make it be more meaningful and even just to wrap up the story in any cohesive way, it just didn't work, and it just fell apart for me. And finally, in 2019, I have a novella, a YA novella, The Lost Sisters by Holly Black. This is a companion novella to her Cruel Prince trilogy. I can't remember the official name. But anyway, it was supposed to give some dimension to one of her less popular characters to try to underscore why she behaved the way she did in the series. And I think at the time I liked it more than I did now. I especially have a soft spot for underdogs, and this particular character is so despised that I wanted to see a better side to her. But I don't really think that Holly Black pulled it off. Even when I read it, I realized you wouldn't be into this novella without having read the rest of the series anyway. So I think if you like the series, the Cruel Prince series is a lot of fun in a soapy way. You might get something out of this novella, but otherwise not so much. And finally, my longest book is also fantasy, but I'm moving on to adult, which I'm very excited about, especially with this one. This is The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, and if you watched one of my earlier videos, you'll know it's my second favorite book of the year. So I loved this one. This is a gender-bent retelling of St. George and the Dragon. It is humongous, obviously, and it is chock full of different cultures and complicated magic systems and complicated lead characters of various walks of life. And I'm going to stand alone here when I say this, but I hope this isn't just a standalone. That ending, I think, was a bit ambiguous, and I would love to see more. So that about covers it for me now. I will leave links to all of my Goodreads reviews for these books down below, if YouTube will let me. If not, I'll find a way to do it. And I'll be back in the coming weeks of January to talk about other Goodreads-related stats for the decade, although you should see me next, hopefully, to do my Friday Reads video this week. So I guess I'll sign off now while I still seem to have battery left. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.